My name is Richard Moultrie, Jr. I am an assistant United States attorney in Atlanta, and I prosecute major crimes, including human trafficking matters, violent bank robberies, anti-terrorism cases, immigration matters, and other crimes against children.
Thank you. What is human trafficking?
Human trafficking covers a broad array of crimes against victims who are forced to commit commercial sex acts. Human trafficking can include sex trafficking of children, and that basically is where someone forces a child who is under the age of 18 years old to engage in sex for money. Also, human trafficking involves crimes where adult individuals are caused to commit commercial sex acts, either by force or fraud or coercion. Coercion being a threat to the person, his or herself, or a threat to a family member, for example. But human trafficking can also include financial crimes where, for example, a person is forced to work for another person as a nanny, as a housekeeper, where the way that the person is forced to work is either through a person holding a debt over the heads of the person that they forced to work, or by alleging or making the person believe that if they don't work, that they'll be arrested. And for example, people that come from other countries, a person who's forcing them to work might tell them that they'll refer them to immigration officials. So in that way, a person can be forced to work just by psychological trauma, as opposed to someone being locked in a cage or being chained up in someone's home. So human trafficking can cover any one of those areas.
Okay, thank you. How does someone become a victim of human trafficking?
That's an interesting question, Jared. It depends on whether you are talking about human trafficking involving children or whether you're talking about human trafficking involving adults. So let's start with children. Very often, children who are victims of human trafficking are homeless children. But they also can be children who are forced to commit commercial sex acts by a caretaker. Very often that might be a step-parent or some other guardian with whom the child is living. Very often children who are forced into human trafficking are range in age from 11 to 14 years old, when they are initially groomed, when they are initially identified for sex trafficking. If you are an adult, very often what happens is with the human trafficking cases, at least that we see in Atlanta, are cases where primarily women are brought from Mexico and brought into the United States and then later into the Atlanta, Georgia area and used in the sex trade. And very often the way that they are forced to do that is men who are traffickers tell them that they're going to bring them to the United States because they have a romantic relationship. They're going to get married. They're going to have a home. They're going to live together. And so that way, a lot of the human trafficking cases that we see with adults, at least in the Atlanta area, are the prong of the crime that I mentioned to you: use of force, use of fraud, use of coercion.
Do race and gender matter in human trafficking?
They can, not necessarily. The crime of human trafficking really is about control more so than it is about the race of any particular person. Or in terms of gender now, we see more cases of human trafficking where the victims are female, either girls or women, but we also see human trafficking cases that involve boys. So in that way, gender may play a role, but not necessarily. It really is more important to think of human trafficking crimes as crimes against people that is about control for the person who's trafficking the victims. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. How big is the human trafficking issue in the Atlanta metro area?
It's a big issue here. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta is one of the top cities for human trafficking cases involving children, and it also is one of the major cities involved in adult human trafficking with respect to women who are brought from Mexico, as I was explaining to you. And the reason for that is because you have I-75, 85, a major interstate corridor, but you also have the Atlanta-Hartsfield Airport, which is a major airport in the country. And then you have a large immigration population of agricultural workers who come from areas like Mexico, are away from their families, and that can create an environment where human trafficking can flourish. So it's not to sort of carve out or identify or focus on any one particular group, but it is to recognize that in our particular area, human trafficking is a big problem for particularly women coming from Mexico.
Okay, thank you. What is the average length of time victims are usually held with captors?
It's hard to say an average time. What I can tell you is the cases that I've handled, forced labor in particular, very often there's a time frame of roughly around 3 years in between the time that the person is identified, that the trafficker begins the process of grooming the victim to travel to the United States, for example, with forced labor cases that we've seen here, and the time that it takes for that victim to finally make an outcry. That is, to finally let someone else know what is happening to him or to her, and for someone to then step in and for that victim to either flee the environment where he or she is being forced to work, or for some third party to step in and help, which is what I have also seen very typically.
Thank you. How do victims usually escape captors?
I'll give you an example. There was a recent case involving a woman from the Kingdom of Swaziland, 29 years old, who was a domestic worker in her native country, Kingdom of Swaziland, a very small country in Africa. She had never traveled outside the United States, but she met a minister and his wife who traveled to Africa frequently selling a product. And because the defendants, the minister and his wife, were a minister and his wife, the victim, who had never met them before, thought she could trust them. She met them through a friend of hers. They convinced her to come to the United States, specifically to Lithonia, to cater a wedding. So she thought she was only going to be here for 6 months. She'd be able to learn something about the trade of culinary arts, learning to cook in the United States, go back to Africa where she was going to be married soon, and that she could remain independent from her husband by opening up a small restaurant. Well, instead, when she arrived in the Atlanta area, she found out from the wife that they were actually going to be making her work as a nanny and a housekeeper. She was here for 2.5 years. The way that she escaped is there were times when the victim would go to church with the minister and his wife, and there she would meet some of the minister and his wife's friends. One of those friends, an older couple, reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation that they had continued to try to get to know the victim by talking to her, by inviting them over to their home, because they sort of saw her as one of their own daughters, just because she was around the same age as their own children. Finally, the victim opened up to the older couple about what was happening to her in the home of the minister and his wife, and they helped her to leave. They put her on a bus, got her to D.C., where an organization called Safe Horizons, which is a non-governmental organization, and that simply means an agency that helps victims in crisis, victims, for example, of human trafficking. This organization, Safe Horizons, helped the victim to get back home to her native country, again, the Kingdom of Swaziland. Her family, for a long time, thought that the victim was dead. Her fiance thought that she was either dead or had decided to stay in the United States without telling him. But fortunately, when she got back home, they got married, and they now have a baby. So there was a happy ending, even though it took her roughly 2.5 years to escape. But that was one example. There was another forced labor case that we had here in our office in the Northern District of Georgia, where similarly a friend of the person who was trafficking 2 of the victims who were here from Nigeria thought that something looked strange, decided to do some research on her own, decided that she thought that what was happening is that her friend was engaging in human trafficking by making these women work in her home, and she helped one of the victims leave, and that was how the story of both the one victim that the lady helped and a second victim, that's how their story came to the FBI. That's eventually how we ended up prosecuting that particular trafficker.
Thank you so much. What is the average sentence for someone who is a participant or knowing about human trafficking?
So it can depend on a couple of factors. If it is a human trafficking case where the government, in my case, where a prosecutor like myself, has evidence to present to the court that the human trafficking was caused by use of force or fraud or coercion, then a person can be looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison. That means a mandatory minimum sentence that in which a defendant has to serve almost for all intents and purposes, every single day of that sentence. So that would be at least 15 years. And from there, the sentence can go up as far as life imprisonment. That's the maximum sentence a person can receive for a human trafficking offense of any kind. But in terms of the question that you asked more specifically, Jared, about typically what we see, I can give you a range of sentences from our recent cases. We had a human trafficker, a pimp, for better word. In a case where we had a single victim who was 16 years old, he went to trial, he was convicted, and he received a 17-year sentence. The story that I told you about, where there was a woman in our district who trafficked 2 young women from Nigeria, that was a case where the evidence that came out at trial was that she had beaten those 2 women while they were working in her home. She received a sentence of 40 years. There was another case of human trafficking where there was a ring of approximately 5 defendants from Mexico who had trafficked a number of women, roughly 10 women and a couple of children. One of the main traffickers went to trial, and he received a 40-year sentence. And finally, there is a case that we have pending where we will be seeking a life sentence for a trafficker. It will be up to the court. Under the federal system, it's up to the judge to impose sentence. So we can't know what this ultimate sentence will be, but that gives you an idea of what range of sentence a person can be looking at who engages in horrific crime like human trafficking is considered to be.
If someone were to witness or take part in or is a victim of human trafficking, where can they go for assistance?
So that's an excellent question. The Federal Bureau of Investigations and the Homeland Security Investigations, formerly known as ICE, Department of Homeland Security, they have websites. All you need to do is have access to a computer, go online, simply type in, for example, Google, type in the 2 words, human trafficking, and information will pop up concerning the FBI's hotline, Homeland Security's hotline, but also additional information about what kinds of indicators you're likely to see if a person might be a victim of human trafficking. But in addition, I brought with me a card called End It. It's an End It movement campaign started by Homeland Security Investigations. On the back of that card, Jared, is basic information about how human trafficking is defined, typically the age that victims are likely to be prone to being exploited as victims of human trafficking, but more importantly, in terms of the question that you raised, how can someone help or how can someone get help? There is a contact number for the Human Trafficking Resource Center, and it's manned 24 hours. So I'm going to give you one of those cards.
Thank you.
And you can share that information.